We drove her up from my great-grandfather's house, which is 5 hours away. She didn't make any noise, never seemed upset. She was always this way on car rides, such as to the vets or when we had to clean the house and take the pets out for the day. She never was bothered by the car. When we took her to give her away, however, she was different. She started just as quietly as normal, but once she got into the car, she began screaming at the top of her lungs. We thought she was just afraid of the car and kept going and going, and then she began shaking her crate so violently that the car shook. Once she began shaking, she stopped screaming and growled in the deepest, most threatening way I've ever heard. I've grown up with cats and know how they sound when they're scared or on the attack. But this was nothing like I've ever heard. My brother and I pulled over and were so terrified by this cat and not knowing what to do that we began to pray out loud. I didn't know what to say, so I just asked for protection. What was odd was the movement. I finished the prayer, and Angel went quiet. The car stopped shaking, and the cat wasn't making any more noise. The look in her eyes went from aggressive to the calm look it normally was. As we kept going, every time Angel began to shake and growl, I would recite the same prayer to myself, and it would stop for a while. I'd like to think she was just frightened, but honestly I can't help but feel there was something wrong with her to this day. She never did seem right, but that was far from unusual. In conclusion, after moving away, we were a lot happier and everything was a lot calmer and tranquil. I hope for the next residents of the house, for their sakes, that whatever malicious entities still reside there get bored and leave. This happened last year at my new job. This guy, Mike, was in charge of my training. At first, he seemed like a nice guy. We'd talk about common interests, have lunch together, normal things that co-workers do. Then one day, he started to overshare things from his personal life. Things like, I hate my wife, who I knew was pregnant at the time, as well as, if I told you that I cut myself in a place that only God and I could see, would you want to know where? Now keep in mind, I'd known the guy for all of 3 weeks when this started happening, and the most personal thing I'd ever shared with him was that I'd been on Prozac in my first year of college, which I didn't think was a big deal, because doctors prescribe it like candy. Whatever, I didn't want to piss him off, because what if he started bad-mouthing me to the managers? I did my best to change the subjects when he went too far off, which was becoming a daily thing. I also avoided being alone with him as much as possible. That didn't stop Mike from deciding that I was his new best friend / sister. He started actually referring to me as his sister from another mother, and then just his sister in front of people at the office. The first couple of times I laughed it off, but then it stopped being funny, because in his mind, this was now a fact. He even tried to make the new spouse relationship on Facebook official. I added him along with some other people from work, which was my big mistake. And by this point, my actual biological brother was itching to have a talk with this guy. But I told him that it wasn't a big deal, and that I would try to gently extricate myself from the situation. Well, that didn't really work. I was having lunch with this other guy from work in the cantina one day. Background: this is a guy who finished the same course I did, but in a different year. We had lots to talk about, and I really liked having someone around my age to talk to. Anyway, I could see Mike giving him the stink eye from across the room, as he was eating alone, in a very obnoxious, "look what you're doing to me" display. The same evening, other guy messages me on Facebook, telling me Mike's texting him over Slack about me. We use this program Slack at work, and some people have it on their phone for out-of-hours stuff. He shows me a screenshot of the conversation. Mike basically is saying shit like, "I'll protect her to my dying breath from scum like you," and "if you break her heart, I will break you." This is some of the most cringe and disturbing stuff I've ever read from someone I know in real life. The other guy rightfully asks me what the hell is going on. Did I tell Mike that we were together or something? Because if I did, he apologizes if he sent the wrong signals, but we are most definitely not together. I'm pretty pissed by now, not just because this is threatening one of my new friendships, but because this is so messed up all around. So I message Mike, asking him to stop threatening my friend, while also apologizing to the other guy over the misunderstanding. Mike replies, "I'm just looking out for you. That's what brothers do, okay?" Alright, deep breaths, this is happening. I message him, telling him that he is a very good friend, emphasis on friend, but I do not need to be looked out for. Really, I don't. He comes back with, "Then I'll just protect you from the shadows," and a winky face. He says some other cringe shit about me being young and naive, which makes me a target. But by this point, I'm 300% done with whatever he thinks this is, so I just block him. The next morning, Mike comes in late, sits his ass down, and immediately texts me on Slack, "Are you okay?" Which I ignore. A bit later, he gets up to go on his smoke break, and he goes past my desk, and he says, "Hey, I slacked you. Did you see?" "Yeah, I saw, but I'm not doing this anymore." I pull off some generic "sorry I'm busy" line, and mind my own business. Lunch comes and goes, and the day goes on without a word from him, until about 10 minutes before it's time to go home, when I get a wall of text on Slack that basically makes me realize that what's happening in Mike's head has absolutely nothing to do with real life. He thinks I'm lashing out because I'm hurt and angry because of my trauma. I'm assuming he's speaking about my depressive episode from a year ago. He says he'll stand by his, and I quote, "dear friend," because he has made a promise to be my brother and defender, and he's not going to take the easy way out and just let me go because I'm hurt. He actually wants me to take out my pain and anger on him because he can take it. I'm sitting there reading all of this, and all I can think of is, what the hell? Mike logs off for the day, and I am still processing all of this. I go down to the parking lot some 20 minutes later, and there he is, smoking next to his car. I ignore him as I walk past him. Thank goodness there were other people around, and he just stands there, unmoving, and staring at me. And I get into my car and drive away. This is where I started to think about talking to a manager. We have two managers, a younger guy and a woman. Let's call them Pam and Pete. I started writing this long email to both of them, and also thought of talking to the other guy to back me up. Remember, Mike had harassed him over lunchtime with me. But in the end, I decided not to. Mike had a kid on his way, and he was clearly in need of mental help, which he probably wasn't getting, and I wasn't about to get him fired and take away his livelihood. Spoiler alert, I lived to regret it. Things were, dare say it, normal, or so I thought, for a while after anyway. Sure, I caught Mike staring at me a few times, but I pretended not to notice. Then after a few weeks of nothing, one of the other girls on our team says that she has something to tell me. We'll just refer to her as the nice girl, because she ended up helping me a couple of times after that. So, nice girl Nikki and I go out for coffee at lunch. There's a coffee place across the street that pretty much everyone in the building goes to. She tells me that Mike has been talking to other co-workers about me and my hurt. How I'm struggling with my depression. And it's so bad. It's even making me push family away. Because we're practically family, if Psycho says so, right? How he's been trying to help me, and it breaks his heart that I won't let him. Because he cares for me so very much. How many people has he been talking to? Nice girl Nikki knows at least one other person. This is making me livid. You can't just go around telling people someone else is mentally ill to make yourself look like a saint. I mean, who does that? Now it's definitely time to speak with the managers. I slack Pete, the younger manager, asking him for a quick one-to-one, and he immediately agrees and says, "Great. Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you. Pam will be joining us too. We just need her to get down here, as Pam is on a different floor." Crap. Oh well, I guess this really is happening. So we meet later in the same day, and Pete starts asking about how I'm getting on, if I'm getting along with the rest of the team and so on. I have the feeling I know where this is going. Sure as rain, he says, "Mike has been saying lots of good things about you, but his face isn't the face of a man who's heard good things." All the while, Pam is sitting there not really saying anything, just nodding and smiling in a way that makes me a bit uncomfortable. I'm starting to get super anxious because I'm a non-confrontational person, usually, and I hate drama. But Mike has crossed all the lines. Still trying to be nice, I say, "Look, I think I gave Mike the wrong impression, and I gave them a whitewashed version of what's been going on." At this point, Pam asks me, "Did you ask him to stop?" Well, not really, but I'd assumed that blocking him on Facebook and not engaging him on Slack or offline sends the same message. Pam then proceeds to give me bullshit advice like, if he starts talking about inappropriate things, tell him you're not comfortable with this and don't engage with him in personal circumstances or outside of work. What does the first thing even mean? They also promise they'll assign someone else as my trainer and mentor, and they'll talk to him over spreading inappropriate rumours, which I insist again are not true. Another week goes by, and nice girl Nikki and myself and another guy who's friends with her are all heading out to get coffee. As soon as we start walking in the door, there is Mike, with 2 cups of coffee, and one of them has my name on it. Thinking back, he must have heard me and nice girl Nikki were going out, and ran ahead whilst we were waiting. He tries to give that one to me, and says something about it being just the way I like it. But my heart is racing so fast, I can't make out what it is, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a heart attack there and then. It was probably a panic attack. By the time I get a grip, Mike's gone, and nice girl is looking very concerned, asking if I'm okay. I look like death. We end up outside while nice girl Nikki's friend is waiting in line. I'm shaking and trying not to cry, and she asks what's going on. So I tell her some of the things Mike's been doing. By the end of it, she looks disturbed and says, I think you should talk to the managers. Well, I already did. She says, tell them about it today. Part of my brain stupidly thinks, but he just wanted to buy me coffee. But I can't really pretend I'm okay with it anymore. As soon as we're back in the office, I go straight to Pam. Normally I'd talk to Pete since he's our direct manager, and Pam is kind of a supervising manager. But I feel more comfortable speaking to a woman about this. This time I tell Pam everything, including how Mike threatened someone else over having lunch with me, and how he stares at me a lot, and has sent me long and creepy texts on Slack that prove he's delusional. She asks to see the texts. I say I'll forward it. I don't have Slack on my phone. And she asks me to forward everything else I have. Not that she doesn't believe me, but she wants to fully understand the extent of the problem. She says it with the same knowing/understanding smile from the last meeting. She also asks me, has he been following you outside of work? Now, she already knows about the coffee incident, and I also tell her about the staring in the parking lot. There's another pause, and then she says, well, obviously we can't fire him. And my heart sinks, but apparently this isn't serious enough for them to boot him. Though, they can discipline him using the company's Slack inappropriately. She asks if I'd like a transfer to another team, but I'd still have to work in the same building as the psycho. Finally, she suggests a mediation, a meeting including her, someone from HR, Mike and myself. She doesn't sound very convinced it'll do anything, and neither am I, to be honest. But I'm panicking just thinking about talking to him again. Did I agree to mediation? Of course I did. Did it help? Of course it didn't. Let me just start by saying I was super anxious throughout. I was literally shaking. I did my best to state in neutral terms that I want to have a professional relationship with Mike, and that's it. I'm not comfortable with him oversharing personal information or talking with other people about my problems, which aren't even real. Throughout this whole thing, he was just sitting there saying, yeah, okay, with this shit-eating grin on his face, like we were just playing pretend. The only time he had any other reaction was when I indirectly said he'd been making stuff up about me. He said something like, well, you kinda told me that, remember? As if that would make any of this okay. The same day, I got a Slack message from him saying, if you wanted me to give you some space, you should have just asked. No need to go to HR about it. He wasn't sitting at his desk, but he was probably in the building somewhere. Otherwise, I'm pretty confident I would have lost my shit right there and then. I sent back something along the lines of, well, I'm saying it now. Please don't ever talk to me again. To which he replies, but we work together, silly, with a winky face. Not long after this HR mediation thing, my brother was picking me up one day from work because my car was in the shop. For a bit of background, my brother is a pretty big guy, but he's a non-violent person, even if he looks intimidating. I'm getting in the car, and Mike is there too, smoking in his car and giving us the meanest, stinkiest look you can imagine from a person. I'm pretty sure he was waiting for me to come out of the building, and it wouldn't have been the first time. This isn't just staring anymore, it's I'll kill you in your sleep staring. My brother notices and asks me if this is the guy. I go, yeah, but just drive. But before I can stop him, he's already walking over. Mike starts getting verbally aggressive as soon as he sees my brother coming. I can hear him shouting from where I'm sitting in the car. He's getting nasty, saying shit like, prick, you stop right there or I'm gonna run you over. And I have a gun. I have a gun. For context, Mike is a pasty white guy, and is as far from gangster as apples are from broomsticks. This is when I lose it. I walk over and just start screaming at him. I've never just let loose at someone in my life, and I honestly scared myself at the time. At this point, Mike just drives off whilst I'm in the middle of it. I was hysterical for the rest of the evening, and I called in sick the next day because I couldn't stand the thought of being anywhere near that person again. Whilst I was out sick, I received a text from an unsaved number saying, "Bitch?" Just that. My brother was already telling me that I should quit the job and get a restraining order against this freak, because it was obvious. People in the workplace were not going to protect me. No job in the world was worth dealing with someone like this, right? I could even stay with my brother and his girlfriend for a while, if I were worried about money. My mind still wasn't made up. But the same evening I received a picture message of a man slitting his wrists. You know how they say, go down the street, not across the road? Well, this was across the road, but it was really messy blood. And I couldn't see a face in the picture, but it was painfully obvious that it was Mike messing with me. I blocked the number and quit the job the next day. I also stayed with my brother and his girlfriend a while, but Mike never tried to get in touch with me again. Or if he did, I never knew it, because I blocked him across everything. That is until last week. You know how LinkedIn has this people who looked at your profile thing, and sometimes it shows you their photo, even if you don't have a paid subscription? Well, last time, I saw that Mike Stalker had looked at my profile. He's still with the company. Needless to say, I'm freaking the hell out, especially because I'm sure LinkedIn showed him I looked at his profile too. I started to write this as a way to keep track of everything that happened between me and Mike, because if he does anything, if he happens to just walk by my current place of work, or if he messages me, I am going straight to the police. So Mike, let's never meet again. My father and I recently got back in touch, and I have moved back in with him. And I have been experiencing, for lack of a better word, a kind of presence in his house. It has been growing more and more powerful. First, just a slight feeling of being watched, to noises and objects being moved around the house. And now, I am unable to sleep. I originally moved back in using my brother's old room, as he had moved out a while ago. I always got horrible feelings in that room that never allowed me to fall asleep. I eventually just got another room, and the feelings more or less subsided. This had all started and escalated within the past 2 or 3 weeks. But I am no stranger to paranoia, and living in this giant log cabin in the woods, it would have certainly been possible to write it off as just nerves from a creepy house. I honestly started believing that I was starting to go crazy. But with these events growing in such strength and history, I now believe if there really were spirits in this house, there is more than one. Anyway, it started out with me surfing Reddit one night. Out of nowhere, I get this nasty feeling that someone is in the room. I can't really describe it, just an unwelcome feeling. At the same time, the objects in our living room started violently shaking, just for a second. The TV, the couch, the racks of DVDs, everything in that confined area just started rattling. There was a big bang, and it all stopped. That was the first night. Over the next few nights, things started to escalate. I started feeling as if I were being watched, like someone was standing over by the table. Still, a very unwelcome feeling. as if at any moment someone would jump out and come after me. Eventually this feeling worsened, and after a couple of weeks, I was feeling it every second I was in that house. The noises grew as well, or feel the vibrations of thudding feet throughout the house in the middle of the night. They started in the back area where the TV and memorial sections of the house were, eventually branching out to the whole main floor. After another week or so, I realized that footsteps were following me around the house. One memorable night, I was working on homework, and the footsteps walked right up to me and stopped. I wigged out a little and decided to call it an early night. I went upstairs to my room, and the thudding footsteps continued downstairs. Then I heard them going up the stairs and into my room. It walked right over to the edge of my bed and stopped. I didn't sleep that night either. This was back before I moved into the good room, and one of the tipping points that made me move out again. It always seemed to be when I was by myself that the activity really kicked off. My father and stepmother went out of town one weekend, and that whole weekend was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I'd be sitting at the computer, playing RuneScape or something, perhaps petting my cat, and suddenly we heard a loud slide and a bang from the memorial section of the house, full of antique furniture and belongings that we'd inherited from recently deceased loved ones. The cat started freaking out, and we went to investigate. I found an old antique candle holder lying sideways on the top of the bookshelf. I don't know how it got there. I called my sister and her boyfriend over. We got drunk and played games, and all was well. So it all kind of kicked off one night when I had to pick up my stepmother from a concert. She got very drunk, and she tends to reveal some pretty personal stuff when she drinks. She went home, and suddenly she completely broke down to me and started telling me all of the paranormal experiences that had been happening to her. Really out of the blue moment. We entered the house, and she just broke down and started talking about how this house was a portal. She described the evil presences that I've been feeling as, well, sometimes it would be so powerful that she would be afraid to move. She would not leave her bedroom without my father by her side. She also explained the temporary visitations of her recently deceased mother and brother, who would only stop by to let her know that everything was okay and not to worry about them. It turns out that before I moved in, she got so wigged out by the bad presence that she walked out to the main road and screamed to leave her alone. It immediately stopped, but then I moved in, and that's when I started to experience the same phenomenon. So after some talking, we decided to split the cost for an EVP recorder, which I still need to pay my half for. It took about 2 or 3 weeks to arrive, and right after we decided to order it, the shit went up to 11. I was never able to sleep on the days that I stayed in there. The cat was constantly freaking out, always felt followed. I heard tapping on the windows at night and in the morning, and the very night before the EVP recorder finally arrived, I started seeing apparitions. I'd get a feeling of someone watching me from a specific area in the house, and when I turned to look, I'd see the shadows start to move by themselves. I fell asleep on the couch that night, as I had become accustomed to, and in the glass door, I'd see the reflection of a full silhouette of a man walking around the room. I couldn't actually see anything in the room, but his reflection was there. I was making ramen the other day, Earlier, I tried after my stepmother, and she had demanded that any spirits in the house stop messing around and just show themselves, and evil spirits were not welcome. As I was about to add the chicken flavor to the noodles, the cat was walking in front of me and suddenly stopped, looked up at some spot right behind me, and simultaneously, I felt a feeling of pure terror, and the cat suddenly reared up, arching its back and puffing out its fur with its tail out. The standard frightened cat pose. But even the cat's eye got wider, and he dropped his jaw. It looked like the cat was trying to scream. As silly as it sounds, I've never seen a cat with such a human-like expression on its face. I didn't even know that they could make that expression, but as it was staring right behind me, I've never seen a cat so terrified, and I'm not sure I've ever felt such fear either. All I can remember is believing I was about to be violently attacked, but the feeling passed as quickly as it came. The cat went back to normal, as he and I were just stuck in an extremely confused look. The cat was antsy for a while after that, and there was a loud bang near the memorial section of the house, and there's been nothing since then. I was just a kid of 9 years old, and I certainly didn't believe in ghosts. I was raised in a strictly Christian household, and the closest thing to ghosts that my family believed in was demons. And it was a brand new house, just built, never lived in a brand new development. We moved in on Halloween night. It started out like the sort of things that you could explain away. Loud creaks, doors slamming by themselves, sudden drafts that didn't seem to have a source. Things you would expect in an old cliched horror house, sure, but not a new one like ours. Then, I was home alone all day, sitting at the family computer. A single footstep sounded down the hall, and then a few more, gradually getting closer. I assumed that my parents had come home, or my sister, or anyone, and I called out, but there was nothing. I grabbed the phone and ran over to our basement. After I called my mother, she confirmed that everyone was out, and that no one was supposed to be in the house but me. I convinced her that I must have imagined it, but I swear those footsteps were as plain as day. None of these things compare, though, to our basement. My younger sister and I played there, but unfinished levels had some faulty lighting, and the lights often flickered or went out. Whenever they did, we'd run upstairs quickly, but never without catching a glimpse of the man we called the Trenchcoat Man. A tall, shadowy man in what appeared to be a trench coat and hat, ducking behind some unfinished sheetrock. There were more stories. Friends who, unprompted, mentioned a similar-looking figure in the basement. One crisis involving a girl taped in a cabinet, and other things. But I was constantly trying to convince myself that I was only imagining it. I was a highly logical child. Everything to me had to be maths or science, and ghostly activities sounded like something my eyes invented or my brain mistook. My parents, Christian as they were uncomfortable when I brought it up, and as I got older, I tried to forget about it. Even now, more than a decade later though, I can remember it with perfect clarity, and my most vivid example of ghostly activity. I'd gone to fetch something from our basement, retrieved it, turned around, and walked towards the stairs, which were located next to a pile of junk, an old microwave, some books, and other things. The instant I turned around. I saw her. A woman with beautiful, shiny, long golden hair, sitting cross-legged atop our old microwave. She was smiling, looking at the opposite direction, and running her fingers through her hair. She was completely transparent. I stopped completely and stared. I blinked. I pressed my fingers on my eyes until I saw those flashing lights. I tilted my head to other angles, but alas, she was real. She was still there, looking out our basement window, near the ceiling, and flipping her hair. I could even read, through her, the piece of construction paper I'd taped up on the wall on the other side of her body. Whenever I look back on those memories and I think that I just must have been an imaginative kid, I remember that woman, and I realize that there absolutely had to be something I just couldn't explain. I am a female in my mid-20s. In May 2009, I graduated high school. A close childhood friend invited my mum and I to her graduation party. Victoria, whom invited us, was one of my best friends throughout my childhood, and often her mother would watch us or my mum. Her mother was called Sharon. Once we got a little older, we were able to stay home alone, and often watched her brother that was a toddler at the time. Her and her brother have different fathers, and many times during our afternoons hanging out, when we were around 11 or 12 years old, Victoria's brother's father would come to pick him up or drop him off. Whenever he was there, I stayed in her room, because even at a young age he creeped me out. He wasn't very polite like my other friends' fathers would be. Even with me growing up without a father, I knew he was a little off. So fast forward to when Victoria and I were even older. She was 19 and I was 18. We did not hang out nearly as much due to us attending separate high schools and, of course, making different friends. However, our mums were just as close as they were when we were kids. So in May 2009, we were making our rounds, seeing as how a lot of graduations were being celebrated. Around 5 p.m, my mum asks if I would like to go to V's party, and, as per a safe assumption, I agreed. So as earlier mentioned, with my mum and I attending different celebrations, I had one of my current besties with me, Amanda, who Victoria was familiar with, because we all attended the same middle school. Anyway, the three of us show up to the party, and there are many people laughing, eating and drinking, just generally having a good time, with good vibes. I must mention now that Sharon, Victoria's mum, is gorgeous inside and out. Long brown hair, beautiful eyes with a perfect smile. In addition to her head-turning looks, she was a peach to be around. Sharon was always the life of the party and made everybody laugh. If you knew her, you loved her. So in the midst of everything, of everyone enjoying their time, we were all instantly greeted by Victoria and her mum Sharon. Her mum was elated that her daughter graduated, and she recently started a relationship with a handsome new great guy. Her mum, I remember, was just exuding happiness. So again, my mum, my current bestie Amanda and I were all having a great time. Suddenly, Victoria announces that her brother and father are outside, and they want to come in and say hi. I immediately put my guard up. Since a young age, I've always had a heightened intuition, and will always listen to my inner voice if I'm uncomfortable. So the vibe slightly shifts as he walks in, because all of Sharon's friends, including my mum, know that he wants her back, and he's been trying to get her back for quite a while. He comes in, and ironically, plops into the first available chair which is next to me, at the large dinner table. Just thinking back on this moment, my stomach churns. He asks me which college I planned to attend to, my goals, and the other typical questions you ask a high school graduate. I remember I answered him swiftly. Keep in mind, these were the questions I was constantly answering for the last couple of months. In a brief pause in our conversation, I asked my friend Amanda if she wanted to go to the little girl's room, so once Amanda and I have left, I exclaimed to her how uncomfortable I was talking to him. I specifically remember saying to her, "It's so weird he's talking to me, because when I was a kid, he didn't even acknowledge me." I asked Amanda if she was ready to leave, and she agreed. We exited the bathroom, and I made a beeline to my mother and told her I was ready to leave. From the moment I told her I was ready to go, I asked her consistently and persistently every 10 minutes to leave, that she was considering letting me take the car and wait for her and Sharon's mutual friend to arrive. At this point, I'm begging my mum to leave, although I previously mentioned my intuition. I didn't really understand my own angst to depart at that very moment. Being an only child, I'm a nurtured brat, and my mum gave in. About 45 minutes after leaving, my mum receives a frantic phone call. One of the mutual friends of my mother and Sharon stated that Victoria's brother's dad had physically assaulted Sharon and her new boyfriend. Coincidentally, the mutual friend's husband is a cop, and was one of the officers at the scene. About 20 minutes after getting the initial update, my mum, my friend Amanda and I went to the mutual friend's house whose husband is a cop, and he periodically gave updates. It was stated that after they had him in custody, that he approached Sharon with a last-ditch effort to get her back. They are talking in the front yard of their home, and when she declined, he kicked her in the stomach. While she was crawling away trying to catch her breath, he walked to his car and pulled out 2 loaded handguns. He shot Sharon in the back twice. While shooting the last shot that ended her life, Sharon's new boyfriend came outside, and he was shot 6 times, including multiple gunshot wounds to the head. Multiple partygoers called the cops, and once they were on the scene, 8 more people were wounded. He then barricaded himself in the house, whilst threatening to shoot anyone who dare come inside, and himself. So one brave officer was wounded, as per how the gunman instructed would be. They eventually got him out of the house, after 10 hours of persuasion, and ultimately getting his mum on the line and her talking him out of further destruction. So now he is in prison for the rest of his life. But Victoria lost her mum Sharon, and not to mention her younger brother will forever have the visual of his father killing his mother. Victoria became her brother's legal guardian, and has been raising him ever since. He is now in high school, and she also has a child of her own. They have of course had hard times since their mother's passing, but Victoria is positive and beautiful, just like her mother, and will always have good things come to her. In closing, this night changed her life forever, and who knows, if my mum would have stayed, definitely things would have been different. I don't know if it's a good or bad thing. I just know I'm blessed to have listened to my gut. There was a small door that led to an attic space in my bedroom when I was 11 years old, and it became habit that I would shut the door as I walked into my bedroom a couple of times a week. I didn't think anything of it. I just assumed my mother didn't close it all the way and that she left it. After a while, I made the mistake of joking with her when she made a comment about me not picking up after myself. I said something like, "Every night, I have to close the attic door behind you. How about you shut it all the way when you're done? She then informed me that she hadn't been in the attic in months. I asked my brother, and his response was the same, as well as my father. So then I started to pay really close attention to it, making sure it was closed in the morning, checking it after school, checking after dinner, as well as when I was heading up to bed. And without fail, at some point, it would be open. After a couple of months of wandering, studying, and experimenting, I thought I'd see what happens if I just don't shut it. I opened the door before school and checked it after school. It was still open. I checked after dinner. Still open. Before bed, it was still open. Now I'm laying in bed with my mind going crazy with the open door across the room. So I decide to check it out. So I roll over and focus on the black space in the attic, only to see a face staring back at me. I bolt downstairs, wake my parents, and get ridiculed by my brother. We switch bedrooms. We ended up moving into a new house 6 months later, due to an expanding household, and my new physics teacher and his wife bought our house. I could have forgotten all about that event and chalked it up to me having an overactive imagination. But then my senior year, I discovered how awesome our physics teacher was. It became my favourite class by far, and he was my favourite teacher. At the end of my senior year, my friend and I took our VHS camcorder around town, doing mostly silly things, but then took it to my old house to see what they'd done with the place. We got a very fun tour, and I got to tell stories about all the projects my dad did that were still part of the house. Then the wife leads us upstairs to show us the sewing room. I ask jokingly, "Notice anything strange in this room?" And I kid you not, her face goes blank. On camera, she asks what I mean, and I try to shrug it off, but end up saying something about the attic door. She confirmed that every time she comes up to sew, the attic door is open. She then tells us that the second day of being in the house, her dog, a German Shepherd, had gone into the room, but would not go back downstairs. He started barking and could not be consoled, and then jumped through the window, landing on the tin roof over the porch, and then running off. The dog did not come back until the next day, and has not stepped foot into the hallway that leads upstairs since. I had the initial thought that I could show my parents and brother the story I had filmed, but I just decided to let it be. I am a single mother of 5 sons, who are now adults. While they were teenagers, we lived in a century home, beautiful and large with plenty of room for my brood. I should mention, our house was the house that all their friends congregated to. There were rarely nights on weekends and summers that we had less than 6 teenage occupants. I tell you this to try to make you understand that these stories I'm about to tell you are truth and corroborated by many people. When we first moved in, everything was nice and quiet for a few months. Then slowly, activity progressed. My sons and I were all having unexplained happenings. They didn't tell me for almost a year because they didn't want to frighten me. My first experience was being woken up at around 3 a.m. At first, I was in a half awake and half sleep mode. What woke me was a very loud noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like the boys were rearranging furniture. Very heavy furniture. Loud scraping. So loud that I was sure they were scratching the wooden floors. I instantly became furious and marched upstairs ready to bust some butts. When I got to the top of the stairs, though, all was quiet and dark. I started opening bedroom doors, only to find all the boys sleeping soundly. I thought, wow, that was a vivid dream. To my dismay, though, it happened a couple of months later and became more and more frequent until it was almost a weekly event. I was speaking about this with my neighbor, and she got a really funny look on her face. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "I don't want to scare you, but when my sister, who's clairvoyant, was over, she looked up at the window, pointing to one of the boys' rooms, and said, 'She has company.' I asked her what she saw, and she said she saw a man and a woman in old-time clothes staring back at her. At some point, I decided I want to share my experience with my sons. When I did, they all broke out with their own stories. Some of them had been touched, some just heard noises, or felt their beds being shaken violently in the middle of the night. Here are a few of the most memorable ones that stand out in my mind. We being myself and around 7 to 9 teenagers filling up every square inch of the living room, were all just visiting and half-watching Family Guy. My youngest decides he was tired and going up to bed. Away he went, only to return a short time later with pale skin and wide eyes. He said he'd gone to his room, closed his bedroom door, and got into the top bunk. That's when he heard the door handle turn, heard the door open, and shut again, and then felt someone sit on the bottom bunk. He figured it was his brother, and leaned over the bunk and yelled something trying to scare him. He said he froze completely when there was no one there. He was completely alone, hence the wide eyes and pale skin. He truly looked like he'd seen a ghost. One morning, I woke up to find my boys and one of their friends all sleeping everywhere in the living room, which wasn't allowed in our house. I woke up my second oldest and asked him what the deal was. He said that they couldn't sleep upstairs because something was opening and closing all the doors at night. He said they'd wake up and prop things in front of the doors to prevent them from slamming, only to be awoken by slamming. He said, "Ma, those ghosts keep moving the stuff we put in front of the doors. We just decided to sleep down here," and I couldn't blame them. My oldest subsequently joined the Marines, and on his month-long furlough after his Iraq tour, he had a very creepy encounter. He said he was lying on his stomach and reading from his laptop when he felt something sit on his bed. He said he looked over and saw an indent of a person sitting there and loudly screamed and ran out the room. He said he looked over and saw an indent of a person sitting there and said out loud, "I hate ghosts," and not a second later, he said he was being pushed into the bed. He spoke the name of Jesus and it quickly got off him. My final straw was on Halloween night of all times. I was at the computer in the dining room home alone, and I felt something behind me. I turned and heard my name being said in an awful low and sinister growly voice, and then the sound of something large falling down the staircase. It was so loud, I thought I'd find a broken dresser at the bottom, and there was nothing. Nowhere. I searched upstairs and outside for the cause of the crash, but nothing. I finally had my pastors and the elders of the church come and bless my property and my house. There have been no strange activities since then. I no longer live in that house, but one of my sons have bought it, and according to him, the house is still clean. I'm a 52-year-old punk musician from Queens, New York, and I've been into punk since the 70s. Mind you, this is my first time sharing a story. I usually write songs, not shared past life stories, but figured it's my time to share. This story should be shared, because the 70s and 80s were a crazy time. This happened somewhere in the early 80s, when I was in my late teens. I live pretty close to a cemetery, but I'll keep the name out for the respect for the deceased. Those of you who were around in the 70s or early 80s know that there was a big devil worship following, from movies like Race with the Devil with Peter Fonda, and tons of books. I actually have 2 stories about devil worshippers that I encountered, and this is one of them. This encounter happened in 1981, so before that, let's go 3 or 4 years till about 1997. I was 13 years old. My cousin and I wanted to walk to Steinway Street, where all the cool stores were, including 2 head shops that had anywhere from pop paraphernalia to rock posters. A boy's paradise. So I thought of taking a shortcut and walking alongside the cemetery with my brand new pair of Pro-Ked sneakers I had just gotten a few days earlier. Mind you, the oncoming traffic was fast, so we had to be careful and walk on the curb. But there wasn't much of it, just a small patch of dirt and the metal fence behind the cemetery. And the metal fence, and behind that, the cemetery. As we were walking, and probably talking about the last episode of the $6 Million Man, I noticed I stepped in something. I yelled out to my cousin Gary to stop. Shit, I stepped in something. When I looked down, I noticed that my right foot was ankle deep inside of a decapitated German Shepherd. The dog was decomposing, so my foot went right through a rib cage area, and it was very mushy. I was nauseous, shocked, and everywhere in between. So I told Gary that we should just go home, and to forget about Steinway Street so that I can get these shoes and socks off and put them in the garbage ASAP. I must say that was the longest walk home of my life. The smell alone was putrid, being the dog had been there for a couple of weeks. I don't know how I missed it. I showered, got yelled at by my mother to not go that far again, and to stay in the neighborhood. Okay, let's go back to the early 80s. My friends and I got stoned and were drinking quarts of beer. That was the norm in those days. I used to carry a tape deck, boombox, and always had my punk blasting. It was getting late and started to get dark, and I remember the time I stepped into the decomposing dog. So I shared the story with my friends. There were 4 of us, 2 girls, 1 boy, and myself. We were all pretty stoned and buzzed, and they all seemed to have had some kind of creepy story about the place. And one of the girls decided, hey, let's go into the cemetery late at night. At first, I was thinking there was no way I wanted to do it, but I sounded like a pussy, so I just said fine. The other 2 agreed, and we decided we'd meet back at the park around 11:30 p.m. and head out into the cemetery at midnight. I will add that we did go into the cemetery in the daytime a few times when we cut out of school, as it gave us something to do, and somewhere to go without being recognized by family members or the cops. In those days, the cops would take you back to school if they saw you walking around on the streets. In the cemetery, they had one very old road with cobblestones that we used to love to check out, because it was the oldest road that stayed original. They had headstones dating back to the 1800s, and we could get stoned and read them. Hey, holy shit, check this one out. The old brittle skinny bone headstones were the really cool ones. Then, when around 3 o'clock came around, we would all head home, like we had been in school all day. We never saw anyone else, except the one time there were 2 boys walking around with guns. They were walking parallel to us, and it was very woodsy in some parts of the cemetery, and I remember thinking, who the hell is that? We were staring at each other from the other end, and they were probably thinking the same thing. One of the girls was a tomboy with long blonde hair, the tough kind. She started yelling at them. "What the hell are you doing in here? Are you starting to mess with us?" We all stopped and stared at each other. They were outnumbered by 2, but they had what appeared to be 2 guns in their hands. So, we were scared shitless. I told her to shut up because they had guns. She was one tough chick, and said, "Screw this. Let's go towards them and see what their deal is." So we started walking towards them, and they just started walking towards us. I remember wondering to myself if they were real or just BBs. If they were violent teenagers, we could overpower them. But if they were real, we were pretty much done for. We did bring 2 large sticks for weapons, just in case, but used them for walking, so they wouldn't feel threatened. Better safe than sorry, right? We headed towards them, and we started small talk to break up the tense situation, and they seemed nervous being outnumbered. We asked them if they were real guns, and they told us they were just BBs, and that they were there to shoot rats. We were all relieved, I'm sure, and we all thought that it was pretty cool, so we started looking for rats to shoot. We never did find any, and I must say I was glad, because I'm not into killing animals. So we drank more beer and smoked more pot and headed home. Now back to when we decided to meet back at the park at 11:30 to take our midnight stroll through St. Michael's Cemetery. So I decided on leaving my tape deck home, in case something went wrong. It was too big to run with, and we were on a mission, and I rarely went out without my punk music. The older generation used to call me the tape deck kid. Anyway, you'd think one of us would have had the brains to bring a flashlight. Nope. So we met at the park as planned at around 11:30 p.m. The witching hour was upon us soon. And it was about a half-mile walk to the cemetery. As we got closer to the cemetery, it got darker. Luckily there was a bright moon that night, so the skies were clear. On the side we were, there weren't any fences in those days, just a bunch of wood down the embankment, and there was the cemetery. We broke through the branches and the torn thorn spider webs, and all at once, we got through the woods. We broke through the branches and thorn bushes, spider webs and all. Once we got through the woods, we stopped and regrouped. That's when we noticed that none of us had a flashlight. But luckily there was a bright moon to give us some light, and continued to go into the cemetery. We didn't know where we were. We just realized we were on a skinny dirt road, and not really sure what was on both sides of us. I remember thinking to myself, this has gone far enough. Let's get out of here ASAP. And I'm pretty sure they were feeling the same. Well, except for the tomboy probably. The 4 of us were marching on in 2 rows side by side. It seems the further we got, the closer we were until we were touching each other's shoulders. All of a sudden I heard something in the distance. I could have sworn I heard a dog barking. One of them said it was my imagination getting the better of me, but I wasn't sure. We started walking on, but not as fast. Now this time all 4 of us stopped at the same time, when they heard the same thing. Yes, we all heard dogs barking all around us, but not sure which direction it was coming from. But it was being echoey, and they were big dogs, possibly German shepherds. Now we were holding each other's arms tight and listening. I was wondering if it could be the caretaker's dogs, if he let them loose at night to guard the cemetery, and to keep people like us out. Or could it be wild dogs? Either way, it sounded like they would tear us to pieces. Now at this point, any normal person would run as soon as possible. But no. Just like the 4 burnout idiots we were, we decided to carry on. The adrenaline rushing through our bodies was off the charts as we slowly cuddled together and walked forward, as our heartbeats were racing faster and faster. "Let's just keep walking," someone said. I was too scared to talk, so I just listened. Then it happened. The scariest moment of my life. One of us yelled out, "What's that? Do you see that?" We all froze and held our breath. "See what?" I said. "I see lights flickering towards us." "Do you see it?" Directly in front of us on our path, coming towards us, were candle lights. The closer they or it got, the more of them they were, until it looked like there were at least 100 coming our way. We all stood there silently, trying to comprehend what was going on. Now at this time things were getting worse. The dogs were getting louder and louder, meaning that they were getting closer to us. At this time, we were squeezing each other's arms in fear. Then we heard it. Now we heard a flute playing. Someone was playing a flute, and behind the flute, there was a low chanting sound. I was petrified with fear. Then it hit me. I knew exactly what it was. Visions of decapitated dogs and all the scary stories hit me at once. I spoke out with a loud whisper. It was all true. The devil worshippers were coming our way. Run! I wasn't very tall, but I was one of the fastest kids in my class, and had won medals for the 100-yard dash at school. I took the lead like a bullet and ran my ass off. I was trying to keep focus with the small amount of moonlight I had, without running into a tree or worse. I was afraid of falling, because I couldn't feel myself running because my legs were numb. Fear had enveloped my whole body. Next thing I knew, I found myself on the highway next to the cemetery and the streetlight. I was standing in the middle of the highway, not caring about the cars. It was very late, so there weren't many on the road, and that's where I waited for my friends, and they all started appearing out of the darkness. So I yelled at them, "I'm going home. I'll call you tomorrow." They lived in the other direction, so we parted, and I ran all the way home without looking back. The next day, we called each other to make sure everyone was okay. We were hungover as usual, but contented we survived. We dodged wild dogs and devil worshippers, so in those days we felt invincible. We seemed to be untouchable. Or we were just really lucky. That night was never mentioned again until now. The 1970s and 80s were a really crazy time, but those were the best times of my life. Every day was a new adventure. The music, everything was great back then. I wouldn't trade that for anything. Well, that's my story. Let me note, thank God we didn't have flashlights, or they would have spotted us, and I most likely would not be able to retell it now. My girlfriend and I moved into an apartment complex, a bunch of fourplex. Not too long after we moved in, we got our first dog. All was well for a few weeks. After about a month of having the dog, I was walking her outside, and a little kid walks up to us, around 7 years old, and he said his name was Owen, and he asks if he can pet the dog. Of course, I didn't think anything of it and said yes, and then he asks if he can hold her. I figured why not. Owen then picked up the dog, squeezed her as hard as he could, instantly causing the dog to squeal. I told him that was not okay, and that he shouldn't treat animals like that. I know this is not scary yet, but bear with me. A couple of days later, whilst I am home, I hear a knock at the door. It's Owen. He asks if the puppy can come out to play, and I tell him that she is sleeping, and then he asks for candy. We keep a bowl of candy on the coffee table in plain sight. I say sure, but make sure it's okay with his mother before he comes back. This happens 3 or 4 more times over the next few weeks. Around lunchtime one day, Owen shows up, and he asks for candy whilst holding up a yellow wiffle bat. I tell him that I'm all out of candy, and that he should go home, and he responds, You best have candy when I'm back, or we are going to get you." He was alone. I closed the door and moved the bowl of candy to the next room out of sight. In about 15 minutes, I hear the door open and the storm door slam shut. Owen, without missing a beat, walks in, takes candy, as if he knew where I moved the bowl to, says nothing and then leaves. I chase him out and tell him not to come back and proceed to ask him where he lives. He points to his place, and I make a mental note to go down there at a later time with my wife, because she wears the pants in our relationship. When the missus gets home, we both walk down to the apartment that I watched Owen enter into, and no one's there. It's empty. According to the office, the unit had been empty for some time, and any tenant would only stay for a few months before breaking their contract. Over the next few weeks, the dog and cat go nuts. The dog would sit and growl at the corner behind the front door. For hours, she would watch the corner. The cat would go shit crazy if the doors were shut, scratching at them, shoving his face trying to get them open. About 2 months after the initial sighting of Owen, my wife and I are driving home late at about 11. About 2 months after the initial Owen sighting, my wife and I are driving home at about 11 p.m. So we turn the corner and Owen is there on a big wheel and stares right at us. He points at us and follows us with his finger as we turn around, park the car, and he's gone. Since then we have moved to a new location, but for the year that we lived in the apartment, the dog and the cat never stopped hating doors and corners. We often heard creaking doors and saw reflections in the windows. I'm getting goosebumps just remembering it. By far the creepiest experience I've ever had. I recently watched The Babadook, and the closure reminded me of my own experiences when I had to deal with depression myself. All of this happened when I was 12 to 16 years old. I am now 25 and haven't felt a spirit ever since I felt better. My mother and I used to live in a 3-story apartment. The upper floor was basically my own, with my room, a bathroom and a tiny hallway. I think it all started with my mum asking me where I can put certain things. She couldn't find documents that had been in the living room before, or small things such as pens. Naturally, she blamed me, but when things that belonged to me went missing, she no longer believed that I had hidden them. Apart from this, the television turned itself off and on a couple of times. However, none of this makes you think, shit, this apartment is haunted, so we weren't too worried. Around 1 year later, when I was 13, my depression got a bit worse, and things in our apartment got weirder. I was asleep, but awoke abruptly, only to start crying. I suddenly felt someone petting my cheek, the way you do when babies are crying. I immediately felt comforted and fell back asleep. I remember when I had one of my friends over, we stood in my floor hallway and heard somebody running the stairs up and down. My friend got pale and was genuinely shocked, as was I. A couple of days later, I was home alone and spending some time in my room. The door was open, and I heard someone unlocking our apartment front door, opening it, and then closing it. I then heard someone walking up the stairs and called out for my mum, and I assumed that she'd gotten home early. But when I went to peek to check when she didn't reply, There was no one there. To this day, I am absolutely sure that I even heard the key in the lock. I felt as if I were being watched quite often. It actually got to the point where it was so normal that I got used to it. My mum also said that she saw things move from the corner of her eye, and that she felt as if somebody was there with her sometimes, even when she was alone. Those occurrences happened now and then, but luckily, it didn't scare us too often. We kind of got used to it, and the ghost or whatever didn't do any harm. Then at age 14 or 15, my depression got so bad, I started cutting and tried to commit suicide twice. During this time, my mum told me she saw a white fog walking up to my door. I was a bit scared, but what was I supposed to do about it? Then an incident happened, which really convinced me that our apartment was genuinely haunted. I was in bed trying to sleep, but couldn't, as I wasn't really tired. Out of nowhere, I heard a heavy breathing coming from my couch, which was right across from my bed. Maybe some of you have seen the others. There's a scene at the end when you can hear the old lady breathing. It sounded like this, but more evil. At first I thought I was imagining it, but I was so shocked and frightened that I couldn't fall asleep, and stayed awake for another couple of hours. The breathing never stopped during that time. When I finally had the guts to stand up and just get out of my room. When I passed the couch, the breathing got quieter, but very loud once I was in the hallway. Luckily, my mum believed me and let me sleep in her room. She checked my room, but there was nobody there. Still, she also heard the breathing. I heard it again a couple of times during the day and at night. Aside from that, I saw flashes of light every day, no matter the time and weather. I read that seeing flashes of light can be a sign of a migraine, but gladly I never had serious headaches. Besides, I didn't see those flashes right before my eyes, but outside my windows. To this day, I am convinced that the apartment was haunted, and as weird as it may sound, I believe that my depression basically summoned something. However, I still can't explain the flashes. So if anyone has an explanation, or has felt something similar, I'd love to know. When I was a lot younger, around 13 years old, I got mixed up with a few of the wrong people, and we started experimenting with all kinds of drugs and doing generally illegal things. This all culminated in one summer, in junior high, when I realized I was going down the wrong path, and so got away from those people. Fast forward to my freshman year of high school. I got a random message on MySpace from one of the people who I used to hang out with. This girl may very well have been the most messed up of them all. I actually had a long history with her. We went all the way back to kindergarten. She liked to come up with names for herself, as she thought it would make her sound edgy. At this time, she was going by the name Death Cake. Anyway, Death Cake told me that she wanted to catch up, and that she'd gotten herself together. Apparently she had just gotten out of rehab and was having a welcome home party. Being young and silly, I thought she must really have it together, so I figured why not. It turned out this party was really just me, her and two other people. One of the other two people was a guy I'd never met before. He told me his real name, but also told me that he would like to be referred to as Snow. Alright, sure. I'll go with that. These people just like nicknames, nothing weird about that. Snow says he's 18 and spends most of the night making passes at me. I'm polite, but clearly not interested. Everything in general is getting weird at Deathcake's house, and I'm starting to get a little uncomfortable. I started grabbing my things and getting ready to leave when Deathcake begs me to stay just a little longer. I figured fine, I guess it's the least thing I could do to celebrate her soberness with her. And then after that, I'll never have to hang out with her again. Now, throughout the course of the night, I show Snow pull Deathcake aside to talk with her privately. In the beginning I wasn't really suspect, but a few times I noticed, whenever he pulled her aside sometimes, he would look directly at me while he spoke to her. Deathcake brings out what she calls herbal tea. God damn. I don't know how I could have been so young and stupid to drink that tea. That was the last thing I remember of that night. Next day, I wake up in my living room. I figured we must have had some drinks or something, like old times, got carried away, and they dropped me off and I let myself in. And yet another night of getting away with some illegal fun. The next day, I started getting messages on Instant Messenger from someone I never remembered talking to. He was very nice, and kept referring to himself as my secret admirer. Mind you, at this point I still really don't remember anything from that night. So this guy keeps messaging me and saying really nice things to me. I was actually kind of flattered. 3 or 4 days after that night at Deathcake's house, he tells me he has a present for me, and tells me to check my email. 5 minutes later I check. There in my inbox are 3 pictures of a naked guy. I realise I've seen his face before, and I also realise I've seen his penis before. It's Snow. Suddenly details of that night at Deathcake's house are starting to return. Then I freak out and realise exactly what must have happened to me. Now, before anyone judges me for not immediately going to the authorities, let me just say that if I told anyone, all the details of my past illegal doings would have come up to the surface, and I wasn't about to let that happen. I figured that I would just never have to see this guy in context again, so I kindly told him to piss off and leave me alone. And when you thought this was just going to be a simple date rape story, it gets much crazier. Snow left me alone for a few days, and I get a text message from a number I've never seen before. I love you. Now who the hell would send me that? I figured I'd just leave it alone and didn't reply. They sent the same message over and over, until they finally sent, "We have something special." All I can think of at this point is, nope. Still, I'm hoping he will eventually wear himself out and forget about me. Now I've already blocked his Instant Messenger account, so I got a shock when a new one starts messaging me. Except instead of words, it's numbers and pictures. 30 inches, then a picture of a rope. 34 inches, another rope. I'm sure you can imagine the bricks that I shat when I realised he was quoting my pant size. Then all of a sudden, something cracked in my head, and I went out berserker via Instant Messenger. I told him to leave me alone, and that we'd never be together, especially considering that he sexually assaulted me. He told me that if I wasn't going to cooperate, he would have to lock me away so that I could be his forever. That's when I finally threatened him calling the authorities. I gave him a bunch of stuff about how I have family in law enforcement, which is a complete lie, and if he ever tried to lay another finger on me, I would stop at nothing to see him rot away in prison for the rest of his life. Turns out this was surprisingly effective. I expected him to become more threatening, but instead, he seemed more sad, like genuinely sad. But obviously I wasn't going to try and comfort him. He started saying all this suicidal stuff, which I just ignored until he stopped. Once he stopped, he never contacted me again. I heard 3 days later from one of the people who was there that he had killed himself. A few months later, the same person told me that he attempted to kill himself, but survived the attempt and was now in an inpatient facility. The same source also told me that once he got let out, he was coming for me. This is the part that I had mentioned earlier, where I said I wasn't sure what to believe. The person who told me all of this was completely unreliable, a drug addict, and had a history of terrorizing people in our high school. Who honestly knows what actually happened to Snow? I certainly don't. I haven't heard from him or about him from anyone since. These days I'm a lot less terrified. I'm 22 now, and for the most part, my mental scars have been replaced with the ability to smell crap a mile away, which has helped me and my friends out in similar situations. So that's that. When I was 13, I experienced the ghost of my grandmother. She died in her sleep whilst taking a nap on the living room couch. Afterwards, according to my father and grandfather, every now and again, they could hear her make the trip from the bedroom to the kitchen and open the refrigerator door. A trip she made many times when she was alive. At first, I thought my father and grandfather were making this up, having fun at my expense. A couple years after she passed away, my father and I went to spend the weekend with my grandfather. My father and I slept on the living room couch, as it opened into a double bed. The same couch my grandmother died on. My grandfather left the house to go to a next-door neighbor's house to play poker. My father and I went to bed in the living room, and my father went right to sleep. I, however, laid awake, reading a magazine. After a while, I heard the noise of the back bedroom door being pulled open. I heard the sound of shuffling feet, and I heard the creak in the floor directly in front of the bathroom doorway. I hear more shuffling feet. Then I hear the fridge door being pulled open, and I hear the sounds of glass bottles in the fridge door clinking against each other. Feeling thirsty, I decide to get out of bed and join my grandfather in the kitchen for a cold drink. I go into the kitchen, only to find I'm alone, by myself. I was puzzled. I could have sworn I heard my grandfather walk from the bedroom into the kitchen and open the fridge. It was at that moment that I remembered that my grandfather wasn't home. He was over at the neighbor's house, and he hadn't come back yet. Then I remembered my grandfather and father's ghost stories, and then I got scared. I raced from the kitchen into the living room and leaped over my sleeping father into my side of the bed. Then I went to sleep. I don't know how long I slept for before I woke, but I felt a feeling of paralyzing fear in my body. I was frozen. I was lying on my right side, and it took me a while to work up the courage to turn my head to the left. My head was covered by a blanket. There was a shadow being cast onto my blanket. The shadow was the outline of a head and the shoulders of a woman with a beehive hairdo. My grandmother used to always have a beehive hairdo, even years after it went out of style, up until she died. I heard heavy breathing coming from the shadow. I had to work up the courage to move one of my hands to remove the blanket off my face, and when I did, in an instant, The paralyzing fear I felt was gone. The shadow was gone. The sounds of heavy breathing was gone. My father was still sleeping. I pulled the blanket back over my head and went back to sleep, only to wake up on my right side, and the paralyzing fear was back. I forced my head to turn. The shadow was back. The heavy breathing was back, and again I summoned up all my courage to move my hand and take my blanket off my face, only to find that there is nothing there, and the feeling is again gone. I went through this same routine the entire night. I lost count of how many times it happened, maybe a dozen, maybe more, but it happened a lot. The next morning I told my father what happened to me throughout the entire night as he slept. The sound of the bedroom door opening, the shuffling of feet, the fridge door opening, nobody in the kitchen, being awakened with paralyzing fear, the shadow, the heavy breathing, and the repeat performances throughout the night. I kind of expected him to tell me that I was just seeing and hearing things, but instead, he just smiled and exclaimed, "That was Grandma." Before my older sister was born, my parents travelled pretty extensively all over Europe and Africa, and met a lot of people. Before this story started, we had 3 English dudes staying with us, 2 of whom were hooking up with each other whilst their wives and kids didn't know, and the other guy had ditched his job in England to come over here to hook up with a 19-year-old he met on Facebook. He was like 54, so pretty much my parents had a whole lot of interesting people staying at ours leading up to this event. This happened a couple of years ago, when I was around 13. My older sister Mary had gone and left for uni, so it was just me and my parents at home. We live on a farm, so our house is pretty big, and we were kind of ratting around in there. So my parents accepted a request from English dude number 1, sleeping with his friend behind his wife's back, to have his 23-year-old son called Justin come stay with us and do work around the farm and pay food and rent. I kind of stayed away from Justin because he smelt really strongly of cigarettes and cheap body spray. Around the same time Justin came to stay with us, my sister's 8-year-old Labrador developed a limp because Labradors have hip problems, and Milo had a history of really bad leg problems. We just kind of assumed she was about to head off, aka Dad didn't want to pay $3,000 for surgery, and my sister was called back home from uni to say goodbye before we put her down. Mary was devastated. Milo had been her 12th birthday present, and she was given to her just after our Nana died, so she was really attached. Justin liked having my sister around too. He followed her around, offered to take her to clubs, and invited her to drink with him when he finished cheering or whatever. Mary was pretty flattered, because Justin was a nice enough guy, decent looking, and from what I remember he was also really charismatic. Anyway, she went out on a couple of dates with him, and Milo's limp cleared up. Mary went back to uni, and everything was sweet. But Justin called Mary like 9 times a week, and went to visit her unannounced, while she was out of town on a skiing trip, and that's a whole other story. And then the dog's limp came back around 3 months later, and what we didn't notice before, when she had the limp, was that Milo got really nervy around people. She already was pretty nervous around men, being a rescue pup before all of this happened, and then she started shaking when she got petted. Dad took this as a sign that the dog needed to be put to sleep, because she had a brain tumour. Okay, Dad. And Mary was called back down to say goodbye. This time, Mary was 100% focused on the dog, instead of Justin. I suppose it was real for her now, and she never left Milo's side in the week leading up to the vet's visit. On the night before, she decided that she wanted to sleep with the dog before it was put down. We all went to bed, and Mary headed down to the dog run that we had for Milo with a shitload of blankets to sleep cuddled up next to the dog and hug it, so Milo would spend her last night in the arms of someone who she loved. It was a pretty big run for just one dog, because the people we bought the farm off bred spaniels, and the kennels the dog slept in were literally the same size, if not bigger than my bed. So Mary heads down to the kennel, and hears footsteps like someone was jogging down to the run. At this point it's around 10:30 at night and she gets pretty worried. So she went back up to the house and woke our dad up, and he went down to see what's going on. When they get down, there are no footsteps, but as they get closer they could both hear grunting. Dad assumes it was one of our neighbour's pigs who had gotten out and stuck in the run, which happened about 8 times a week. So he went in to shoe the pig and put it in the paddock so the neighbours could get it the next day. Mary followed him with the lantern so he could see the pig and they could shoo it out. They just got into the run, and there was Justin, with his pants around his ankles, kneeling, about to put his penis into our dog's ass. My dad was petrified in shock, and my older sister, who's quite small and delicate looking, charged forwards and hit Justin over the head so hard with the lantern that the lantern went out, and Justin's nose and cheek were pretty much shattered, and he had to be taken to the hospital, whilst his mum and dad, the secretly gay dad, came and screeched at the family for letting their baby get hurt. I was told Justin had to leave because his grandmother died, and the dog pretty quickly made a drastic recovery from her limp and her anxiety. He didn't have charges pressed against him, and my parents stopped bringing people to our home directly after that. I was home alone with my grandmother. I was her caretaker. She had a serious stroke a few months before that left her paralysed on one side and unable to communicate verbally. It was Easter, and my mother and aunt had thrown a dinner and both gone out leaving a huge mess. It was about midnight by then, and I was bone tired and just started cleaning after putting my nana to bed. Now the past week or so, she'd been doing something new. Sometimes, when we put her to bed, she'd start screaming, just a few minutes after the lights had been put out. And when I'd go in, she'd be sobbing and pulling her hair in fear. Since she couldn't talk, I'd have to ask her lots of yes-no questions for her to nod at. But I was at a loss as how to guide the conversation. All she could indicate so far was through pointing that there was something up in the back upper corner of the room scaring her. No matter what I did, whether it would be reaching for a photograph that had some relation to her dead parents, or kissing a crucifix, nothing seemed to settle her. But tonight she was quiet, so I started on the living room, and I was straightening to put away the stack of towels that belonged in the kitchen. And then I heard voices, men's voices so clearly, I instantly assumed that with the remote, which I had just put away, I'd somehow turned on the TV in a dead-bolted room on the far side of the kitchen. So I picked it up and pressed power. Nothing. I walked a few steps closer to the bathroom, built off the kitchen in such an old house, and I had this pricking sensation. I used to get it a lot as a kid, but ignored it, and the voices somehow faded against the sound of the water pipes. Well, okay, I told myself. I was just overtired. I turned back for the towels, and when I came back, I saw it. These papers on the floor that a moment before were on the table. I was confused. Maybe I was just tired. I placed them and went back to get some dishes, and as I passed the bathroom, I saw a small man in a hat dancing in there. By now I was bullshit, but damn if those dishes didn't need doing. So I shut the bathroom door and brought them in. TV cable on the kitchen floor from the dead-bolted room, right in the middle for me to see. I put it on the table and started scrubbing the dishes. No sir, I was just tired. No ghosts or demons here. I was humming to show how in control and unconcerned I was, scrubbing up to the last casserole dish, when I heard 3 loud knocks on the sink bottom. Like something was crouched in the cabinet underneath and rapping on it with its knuckles. I picked up the dish and dropped it experimentally to see if it would cause an echo. I'd just dropped it in a moment before, and there was silence. So I just went back to scrubbing, a little more subdued this time. The cabinet door then swung out, deliberately hitting my knees twice, with a little pause between both. Forget the dishes. I dropped that stupid thing, went back into the living room, and repeated the Lord's Prayer until the prickly feeling left all of a sudden. My Nana's room was on the far side of the living room, and I did not want that thing anywhere near her. She never screamed at night either. I'm an American living abroad, in a place with lots of natures and mountains, not far from my house. It's been a great past month of summer weather, and I've taken advantage of it by hiking every single day. Now the country I'm in is incredibly low-key, especially in the residential towns, so the illusion of safety remains. The mountains are just less than a mile away from our house. On this day, I was chatting with a friend in the US, and decided to go up to the mountain's base and loop back down. It's about 3 miles, but not as strenuous as hiking up the damn thing. So I'm chatting with her animatedly, and making my way up this sloped paved road to get to the base, and have a first unsettling encounter with a truck driver who tries to solicit me. I just gave him this look like, "Bye Felicia." This doesn't turn into anything, but I'm on my guard. I am by myself after all, and my husband is at work. I get to the base and I'm telling my friend about this creepy truck driver, and suddenly I have the urge to get out of plain sight. I'm at the mountain's base, which is to the left, and in front to the right of me, probably 1/8 of a mile away, is a parking lot. This mountain also has skiing in the winter, and is quite a popular place. Anyway, I get across the parking lot to the right, and enter the forest across from the mountain. I'm super thirsty, and the stream water on the edge of the forest is drinkable, so I start taking sips from my palm. Now this area of the forest is right by the parking lot, with a walking trail to get back down from the mountain base, but is still enclosed by lots of trees and shrubs, obscuring it from view of the public. There are also some people at the mountain, which is good. Anyway, I'm taking a break from drinking some water, still talking with my friend, when a different man enters the forest where I'm at. And he starts majorly, seriously, giving himself away from the moment he entered the forest. His body language, gaze, everything was off. Nope, not today, honey. I look him up and down. He's strong, in shape, wearing a white t-shirt, blue shorts, and has brown hair and eyes, with light skin, and is staring at me. But he doesn't approach me. Instead, he walks adjacent to me, crossing the path over the stream, and goes to the other side of the stream directly across from me. I don't hear what my friend is saying. I'm watching him. I notice then that this guy has a knife. Like, clear as day, just has a knife. As he leans up against a tree, gripping the knife in his fist, and he stares at me, waiting to see what I'll do. I quickly decide that going deeper into the trail is a no-go. It seems like he's anticipated that I'm distracted, talking to my friend, and that I'll continue on my way. This isn't an option, because the trail doesn't lead to a road that cars can drive on for a good while. There's much fewer people on this trail too. I've seen enough horror movies. I suddenly realized that my uneasiness to get out of the mountain was probably because I was about to be pursued by the knife man, not just some sleep-deprived truck driver looking for a good time. I turn on my heel and sprint out the forest. Luckily, I see a car driving towards where I am. It's a mother teaching her daughter to drive, and it randomly started to downpour rain, and I look like a lunatic myself running towards them. I'm a 5'7" blonde girl, not a creep with a huge knife. I explain to them what has happened, and they let me into the car immediately, lock the door and call the police. After about 30 seconds, the man exits the enclosure and starts walking back in the direction of where I came from in the mountain's base. He's walking briskly and doesn't have a car of his own. The car I got into had tinted windows, so I don't think he knew I was in it. I tell the mother that that's the guy, but we don't want to provoke him, and he disappears quickly before the police arrive. I give the policeman a description, but I don't think they ever found him. Part of me now wants to believe nothing would have happened, but he did go really out of his way to make me feel uncomfortable. Everything about him was bad, and he was literally flashing his knife at me, sizing me up. It seems to me, anyway, that he knew I was foreign. I was on the phone and might not have noticed him. I looked like an easy target. But it's thanks to what I've heard in these stories that I'm more vigilant than ever, and squashed the situation before it escalated. A bit of advice for men. If you see a woman alone, leave her alone. Don't provoke her, even if you think it's funny. We don't ask for it. We want to enjoy our time out, without worrying we'll be apprehended by some creeps. I've had a couple of unsettling dreams and anxiety about the situation. Don't be the source of another person's nightmares. Freaky knife man, get a life, and let's not meet ever again. When I was a child, I wanted to believe ghosts were real. I wanted to desperately prove that. For many years I tried, but to no avail. Until I turned 18. By then I did believe that some things couldn't be explained, and was slowly losing hope. But in an aviary that had lovebirds, cockatiels and budgies, equaling to about 500 in total, anyone who has dealt with small breeding parrots understands that some parents aren't good to their chicks, and will abandon and abuse them. Of course, the parents were kept more as pets and were not allowed to breed, and so I would become the new mum. Take into consideration that feeding chicks is a lot like feeding a human baby. They want to be fed even at night, in 2 to 4 hour intervals. One night, I was laying in bed, and had said my pleasantries to my friends for the night. In my silence, I was recollecting some memories, and my silence broke. I heard an odd gurgling sound. I figured it was the little water bottle I kept for my little fledglings, and thought nothing much. Dead silence followed through the room, and I began to become a little alert from the oddness of it all. Again, the queer quietness was stolen. The sound was akin to gurgling or croaking, and I have no idea how to describe it really. It just made my body go into fight or flight mode, and my hair stood on end. Honestly, it sounds like a cliché reaction, but it's true. I looked around and saw nothing. I decided my next course of action was to ask if anything was in the room. My little birds squeaked tiredly back, but nothing was seen or heard. I decided to take the next step and slam my foot against the bed. To my horror, I felt a force shove against my bed 4 seconds later. I was astounded and in shock, and nothing happened after that. 2 weeks later, I was walking into the kitchen and went to the fridge. Before I opened the door, that same noise was heard not 2 inches from my face. I don't remember grabbing anything from the fridge, but I do remember walking back to my room calmly, where I noped for the rest of the night. A month later, in the middle of the day, I was talking to my friend on Skype, and the door to my bedroom started shaking violently, and I screamed at my brother to stop it. He yelled from the bedroom that it wasn't him, and I quickly opened the door. Nothing. How my fat-ass brother could silently run to the living room in a second is beyond me. I can't explain it. I'm pretty sure my friend pooped his pants on the other end, and I was happy that something happened in front of someone and that I couldn't explain it. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this installment of Scary Stories in the Snow, with surely more to come very soon indeed. If you have a topic that you would like to see in an upcoming video, be sure to drop it in the comments section so that I'll see if we can put it into a future video. Be sure to smash that like button as well and subscribe to not miss any of my latest content. If you'd like me to read your story in my channel, send it to my email or share it to my Reddit, which can of course be found in the description. Just please make sure to include as much punctuation and descriptive language as possible to maximize the chances of it being read in future. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.